Good. I'm glad to hear that. Don't come to me in March and say, please can you talk to those guys at Clifford Chance and here's my resume with war studies and human rights in Syria. Won't be the greatest opportunity for jobs. But anyway, I'm glad you finally sorted things out and you stayed focused on what you want to achieve and chose your modules accordingly. So, do I need to go through last week again? No. All of you are here, so it's all fine, right? Do you guys use this lecture capture thing? Meaning, you do. So you can fall asleep in class and go listen to lecture capture. I should turn it off for that very reason. Stop you guys from falling asleep. But apparently not. Hang on, I can't get this thing to work. Give me a second. Oh. Worked perfectly last week and now, what the heck is wrong? Ah. By the way, do you guys know that there is some kind of opening for a pathway assistant? Paid, I think. How many of you applied for it? Oh, nobody's applied. Pathway assistant. Apparently you're supposed to organize parties, among other things. But you will also have some academic support work to do. Anybody heard about it? Sorry? You got an email? Okay. Well, if you're thinking of applying, do let me know, because I'm supposed to finally say, yeah, that one looks efficient. No, that one falls asleep in class regularly. Without a pathway assistant, I'm going to ask one of you to help me out. Can just dump, and I'll tell you why in a minute, okay? The registration lists haven't yet been finalized. Surprise, surprise. So I can't really start working on the, excuse me, the tutorial groups until the registration lists are finalized. I'm not sure how long that will take. That's up to the college office. But in the meantime, without just sitting around and waiting, I thought, let's have some self-help. So what we're going to do is to try to organize a class list, okay? If you can, select a single piece of paper for each row, okay? I've got about 20 here, okay? Please print your name. I'm not an expert in Egyptian hieroglyphs, okay? So please print your name, print your background so I know how I can put people together in seminars. Degree, where did the degree from, and so on, okay? Do you want to help me with this? Thanks. Just give one piece of paper per row, okay? And please, hey guys, pay attention. Don't pass it back, okay? In your row only, okay? So it's row 1, row 2, row 3, and so on. Are we clear? Good. First lesson in how to get to the city and the financial market. Be organized. Oh, we need one going up there as well. Did you get a sheet up there? Okay. Oh, okay. Thanks. you take 3 minutes to try and fill this thing up while I fiddle around with this thing and get it off the ground, I'd be very grateful. At least we can get off the ground and try to get this thing done. So just your name in block capitals, your background, meaning degree and country, and your contact email, okay? That's it. You can get things off the ground. Are you guys clear exactly what I'm going to cover on this module? Yeah? I'm going to just, while you're writing your names down, I'll just recap in 5 minutes what we talked about, okay? Before we move on to today's topic. First of all, okay, invite your neighbor to dinner, but then you can concentrate. Finished your dinner invitation? Okay, can we get back to work now? Okay. Last week, what I did was to walk you through what these modules are about, and in particular, that their focus is entirely on global transactions in the global markets, and that this is a transaction-oriented course. We're here to understand the transaction, what is the lawyering that goes into it, how are transactions structured, what are the legal issues that arise, and most importantly, how do you solve the problems that arise ongoing, okay? And to that extent, I think I made the point that these courses are heavily practice-oriented, completely practice-oriented, and that what we're trying to do at the lectures is to make you have the knowledge that you need to work in the markets, just simply the law, if you want to call it that. It isn't the law as such, but let's call it that. The law, the principles, the rules that you need to be familiar with. And I'm going to go into the small group seminars for which you're going to write your names down, at which we will look very carefully at the details of the rules and, far more importantly, how these rules operate in practice. What's on Facebook? Anything interesting on Facebook? No? Okay. In which case, can we come back to the class? Okay. To focus on the way the rules and the regulations and the law works in practice in relation to real life fact patterns. That is what I will try to do at seminars. It's extremely important. It is perhaps the most important part of the course, because like I said, you can probably listen to me on lecture capture if you wanted it. But the seminars is where you learn the legal skills that you will need when you get out there to a global law firm. To analyze fact patterns, to be able to advise sensibly, far more importantly, practically, and not write a PhD dissertation to Goldman Sachs, they'll throw it out of the window. To learn how to write sharp, brief, clear-cut advice based on a hard legal analysis. That's what I'm going to try and teach you at seminars, and we'll have about 8 months of practice doing that. And I think I'd like you to remember that we would like to work together, me and you guys, in the small group seminars to achieve that objective, okay? Now, okay, I made this point, moving on. I think it is important to realize, and that's why I made that point about what modules are you going to take, because there's no point doing all these modules unless you have a focus, unless you have a plan on what you're going to do at the end of the LLM. Otherwise, it's all over the place, and you haven't got a clue where you're going, and that means employers can see that as well, believe me. You pick up a resume and you can see, does this person have a focus to his or her or its studies? If not, you've got a problem, okay? So please try and remember that. I walked you through the statistics, which I'm not going to do today, and the law firms who are involved. Now, I tried to walk you through the various topics I'll be covering in the various modules, those of you who are doing them, in addition to Finance 1. What I did last time in Finance 1, which is this class, is to introduce you to the global financial markets, because without an understanding of that, you won't be able to do the lawyering. You need to know where you are, what kind of market you're in, how does it work. So I'm going to give you a very basic introduction. As a lawyer, you don't need to write a thesis on financial markets, but you at least need to know what is the difference between a domestic market and a global financial market, and what is the difference in the lawyering that's involved in these two types of markets. Now, after the introduction, I'm going to walk you through, and this is, I think, what I'm going to do today, is to walk you through the most difficult part of lawyering in these markets. Namely, these are all, every one of them, is a multi-jurisdictional transaction. It involves more than one law system, more than one country, usually many countries and many law systems. And therefore, you need to understand how you lawyer these transactions in the context of different jurisdictions, different law systems, different regulations. And that takes us into the complex area of conflict of laws in international financial transactions. That's what I'll get onto once we get through this stuff. It is technical, and I hope you don't feel it's too technical, but I think it's a good start to understand the background, foundational conflict of laws problems and how you solve them before we start looking at these transactions that you have listed up there, namely syndicated loans, bonds, MTNs, GDRs, which are going to be the core of Finance 1. For those of you who are still trying to work out what you're going to do in Finance 3, that's what we're going to cover. They are all related topics, but that's what I'll be covering in Finance 3. I haven't yet finally got someone to commit to helping me out on project finance, so that's still in the air, but I just thought I'd update you. Importantly, please do not ask questions about things that I'm not going to cover. Banking law for a start, I do not touch it. There's a separate course on banking law if you're interested in it. I don't cover securities laws, EU or US, and please don't ask about it. We will only look at those rules which affect the transactions which we are going to lawyer through. That's it. We're not going to say what are the powers of the SEC, what are the powers of the EU regulator, etc., etc. Not interested. Okay, I told you about lectures and teaching, who's doing it. Exams I've told you about. I told you it's an open book exam. Take it home, take it from wherever you like. But please remember, you can't do Finance 3 and the practice project if you want to do the practice project unless you do this module, okay? I also walked you through the various structures we're going to look at. I'm going to start with this one probably next week, but as I said today, I'm going to walk you through the conflict of laws problems that we have and how we solve them. That's a syndicated loans structure. Tells you who's involved, who does the borrowing, who does the lending, where do the lenders get their money from, because they're lending in a number of different currencies. Then we get on to international bonds. That will be our second major topic on this module, where we'll be looking at the issue of notes, pieces of paper, like shares, called bonds, into the market as a means of raising finance, sold to international investors everywhere, sold by investment banks on behalf of a corporate entity or a sovereign state wanting to raise finance in the markets. How does that work? What is the documentation? What is the process? What are the legal issues? That is what we will be covering in bonds, and MTN stands for, by the way, medium-term note programs. We'll look at that at a later stage. GDRs, I'm going to look at. Project finance, I'm not sure. Loan sales, not sure. Asset securitization, that's the diagram. I'm not going to walk you through it because I did that last week, and those of you who turn up for LOIF 3 will be walking through these diagrams on a kind of daily basis. Derivatives, again Finance 3, and I will take you through them product by product next semester, for those of you who want to take this module, and the documentation and the law that affects these transactions. Okay, and I think I told you last week that we talk about the law of international finance, but it's not based on a single treaty or a single convention, that it's a collection of a whole number of laws that are applicable to financial transactions. And therefore, it's a mix of laws we are looking at, and which law applies where into what transaction depends on the fundamental conflict of laws rules. So if you've got a transaction where you've got a Japanese issuer of bonds buyers in Singapore, Brazil, Kazakhstan, and wherever, and the bonds are being sold by US and Japanese investment banks, you've got to work out, well, what laws apply. That is dependent on the rules of the conflict of laws, which we're going to start looking at today. And then you pull those laws together, and you've got an understanding of what law controls this transaction. On top of that, there are the regulatory laws that are applicable to these transactions, which I will walk you through. In addition, we will walk through and we'll look at the standard legal documentation used by the global law firms in relation to these transactions, because that's what the markets work with. So we'll walk you through this. I walked you through, what are the differences between different types of markets, and then we looked very briefly at understanding the basics, and I mean the basics, of the development of the global financial markets. This is not something that we as lawyers need to know, but it's useful to understand it. How did it grow? What's it doing in this part of the world? Why isn't it New York? There are many rules, regulations, tax laws, and other practical factors which have resulted in this. But if you'd ask me to summarize in a few lines what exactly caused this market to arise in the last 30 or so years, and what are the key elements that drove these markets, I can summarize it as follows. One, the growth of the euro-dollar or the euro currency market in the 1970s, the growth of a huge pool of currencies outside their home state, whether it was dollars, Deutschmarks, French francs at the time, or Singapore dollars, Aussie dollars, whatever they are, outside the jurisdiction. That pool, which we used to call the euro currency pool in the good old days, but now it's an international currency pool. That's the first leg of understanding what's happening in these markets. How are banks lending in all sorts of different currencies to which those banks have got no access at all except through the markets? So that's the first leg. The second leg, excuse me, is Regulation D, and similar regulations in a number of countries, which apply to lending in different currencies in the home state of that currency, requiring a bank to place on deposit, free of interest, with the central bank, a certain percentage of each deposit that bank takes. Regulation D is the original US regulation, which is now being copied everywhere, requiring a bank to place on deposit a certain percentage of a deposit which it takes. And that means, as I explained last week, you increase the borrowing costs, because in order to place 5% of your deposit with the central bank of your country and then only lend 95% of the deposit to people who want to borrow, corporates who want to borrow, you've got to charge a higher rate if you want to make some money. So with the result, Regulation D, tight regulations, pushed up the borrowing costs in different currencies in the home state of that currency. The key point of Regulation D and similar regulations is that it didn't apply outside its home state. So if you take dollars, Reg D affected the taking of deposits, dollar deposits, and the lending of dollars, driving interest rates high. But Regulation D and similar regulations didn't apply outside the home state of the currency in question, enabling banks and investment banks outside the home state to actually use these currencies offshore, outside their home state, for lending purposes at cheaper borrowing costs to borrowers. That was a huge push for the syndicated loans markets in the good old days of the 70s or maybe even early 80s, Regulation D. The third leg of this summary is what drove the international bond markets outside their natural home state, namely New York. Answer: President Kennedy's interest equalization tax. It was abolished 20 years later. By then it was too late. It imposed a punitive tax on foreign borrowers coming to the US dollar bond markets to borrow finance from the US domestic market. With the result that if there were dollars outside the US, those could be accessed via international bonds without paying the interest equalization tax, which drove the entire bond markets out of the US because the dollars were there outside the US and you could borrow them without paying interest equalization tax to the US government. Result, the huge numbers of international bonds, which I shown you last week, grew up, became operational in this part of the world because of the interest equalization tax imposed by Kennedy. Now, you also remember that alongside these developments, there were smaller developments like the United States government imposing asset freezes, i.e. anyone with, say, a dollar deposit couldn't move it, it was frozen. Usually done for political reasons, first during the Suez crisis, then during the Czech crisis, then later in relation to the arrival of East Bloc countries putting their dollar deposits in New York, being subjected to freeze orders by the US government, and those countries, East Bloc countries as they were then called, and the so-called, I hate this word, Middle Eastern countries. Middle East, middle from where? Exactly. Being moved outside the US and placed on deposit at this end of the world. So those are the factors which broadly brought the whole market into play. It also saw the parallel development, and this is probably important to you from practical purposes, the growth of the global law firms, which saw huge growth in the 1990s. Why? Because the lawyering was required for these global transactions, and only the global law firms could do them because they had the numbers of lawyers, 3,000 plus, and the offices from Singapore and Japan in the east to New York in the west, and everywhere else in between, London, Paris, Frankfurt, wherever. With the result, those law firms were the vanguard, which was able to take advantage of the lawyering for these global transactions. And that is still the case today, both in London and in New York, where the law firms are located. I don't think I'm going to run through all of this again. There's a whole pile of other stuff that I mentioned. I thought I talked you guys through the 2008 crisis, did I not? So, how many nightclubs did you attend in the last 5 days? Can't remember the 2008 crisis? Okay, it was before you were born, but never mind. Anyone remembers what this crisis is about? Sorry? Lehman Brothers was the ultimate casualty of the 2008 crisis. Exactly. Let's try and just recap, because we'll come across this problem over and over again, and I think it's useful to know. And by the way, have you guys gone and watched the movie Big Short? Yeah. Good. Not yet. Well, go watch it tonight. And margin call. Okay, let me just very quickly, once again, if you say I hadn't talked about this last week, I'm going to very quickly walk this through, okay? 5 minutes, and we're done. The 2008 financial crisis, as I said last week, was a global financial market crisis which affected the global financial centers. It was not something that just affected small banks in Arkansas or in Nijmegen or in the north of England. It wasn't. It started with a crash in the housing market, fall in the value of houses of ordinary people like you, me, and everybody else. Now, how did this affect the global market? Well, because in the past, mortgages were given, loans in other words, small loans, to people who wanted to buy their homes by small banks. And if they couldn't pay the loans, well, the banks went bust. They were small banks. It happened in 1991. And then nobody even took notice of it. The Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal hardly reported it. But what happened in the 1990s was that this little market of housing loans was packaged up by the Lehman Brothers and the Goldman Sachs and the Deutsche Banks in what were called securitizations, which I'll cover in detail in Finance 3, whereby the mortgage loans were taken by the investment banks, bought from the bank which is making the loans, and then putting it into a special purpose vehicle company, mortgage banks, borrowers who were buying houses, they owed them loans. Those loans were transferred by a mortgage bank into a special purpose vehicle company. That special purpose vehicle company got the money to buy those mortgage loans. How? By issuing bonds into the marketplace, into the hands of global investors. And this time, those investors included the Lehman Brothers, the Deutsche Banks, the hedge funds, the Exxon Mobils, and others. It was a big players. And that's how the little mortgages spread into what we call Wall Street, which is essentially the global markets. Now, what went wrong? When the mortgage borrowers here failed to pay the mortgage banks in the old days, they went bust, and that was it. But this time, something else happened. These mortgages, these loans, mortgage loans, were not held by these mortgage banks because they had already sold it to a special purpose vehicle company. So when they failed to pay their loans, who suffered the loss? The special purpose vehicle company. What was the consequence of that? Well, because the special purpose vehicle company had sold bonds to investors on the security of those mortgage loans and expected to pay the bond investors. After all, they don't do this for Christmas, they do it for interest and money. When they didn't get paid their interest on the bonds went into default, resulting in trillions of dollars of bonds becoming valueless in the hands of hedge funds, in Lehman Brothers, and Bear Stearns, and everybody else. That's how the global crisis kicked off. But that wasn't the end of the story, because on the back of these bonds was something else. These things called credit default swaps, which I explained to you. Namely, derivatives contracts whereby major players in the markets, I'm going to take simply the example of AIG because I'm sure you may have come across AIG, had sold credit default swaps to investors who bought securitized bonds. When the bonds went into default under the credit default swap contracts, the investors could turn around and say, my bonds have defaulted, you promised to pay me the value of the bonds if they default. Well, they've defaulted, pay. With the result, the impact was, this little transaction here impacted all the way through to investors who were bond investors, funds, Lehman Brothers and everybody else, and those who had written the huge conglomerates, investment banks, financial institutions, which wrote credit default swaps to cover any losses that bond investors had suffered. With the result that this whole thing became a $2 trillion collapse. That's the financial market collapse of 2008. It resulted in the two sides of the Atlantic, just the EU and the US alone, spending $700 billion each to bail out the banks and financial institutions which would otherwise have gone into complete collapse alongside Lehman Brothers and caused essentially a 1932 type massive economic depression. But that was averted. Now, we can all argue about what went wrong, who was responsible, blah-de-yah-de-yah. The response of the politicians and regulators has been very straightforward. After putting the money, $700 billion each in the US and EU, I mean, there were obviously Japan, there was Singapore, they were all over the place. But what happened next was that because the politicians and regulators felt this was all the fault of those guys making $20 million bonuses, they decided to regulate. And there was a tsunami of regulations between the period 2009 up to date, starting with the biggest one, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act of 2010, which Mr. Trump, of course, has said he's going to tear up in the very, very near future. And on this side of the Atlantic, massive series of regulations, especially targeting the derivatives markets and the securitizations markets, seeking to control activity, transactions in these two particular areas of activity. And there are, we'll come to these later, MiFID I, MiFIR, and EMIR. Nothing to do with the Middle East EMIRs, but this is European Markets Infrastructure Regulation, which all sought to try to bring the derivatives markets and the securitizations market into some form of order. Now, here's the important point. Order which appeared to politicians to be good. Nobody else agreed with them in the markets, but the politicians thought this is what we need to do to bring the markets under some form of order. And they're still there. On top of that, there was something called Basel III, which is a banking regulation, which required banks, the Lehman Brothers and others, to have more capital, share capital, on their balance sheets, so that if another tsunami hits, they will be better prepared and will have enough share capital as a cushion not to go into insolvency. That was Basel III. So all of these things were done in order to bring what politicians and regulators saw were the real problems in the financial markets. There were lots of other ancillary things. For example, we'll come to something called short selling in the global markets. Bonds and shares are short sold, and I'll explain what short selling is. It's basically, in one line, it's where an investment bank, hedge fund, fund manager sells shares which it doesn't have, sells bonds which it doesn't have. Why? In anticipation of an expected price fall. So let's take a simple example. You think that the shares in ExxonMobil are going to fall by 20% in the next 3 months, right? Okay, so instead of buying a pile of ExxonMobil shares or selling a pile of ExxonMobil shares, what you do is you go into the market and you sell ExxonMobil shares, which you don't have, with the expectation that the price will fall in the next month. When the price falls, what do? You go into the market and you buy. Now think, you sell the shares, or bonds for that matter, at 20, when you don't even possess the shares or bonds. Market falls, the share price now and the bond price now, shall we say, is 17. You go in the market, buy at 17, and hand it over to the guys you sold your bonds or shares to at 20. What happened to you? You made $3 on each bond. That's called short selling. It's an extremely effective tool in the markets, but regulators and politicians thought this was bad. This was a really bad thing to do. And they banned it first completely. And then they woke up and thought, we can't do it because markets have to work like this. So they banned it in relation only to bonds issued by sovereign states. In relation to everything else, you can now do it. Then they also brought in little regulations like bonus caps, i.e. investment bankers, in the politicians' view, I don't know, people earning $200,000 a year, I guess, thought these guys earning $50 million at Lehman Brothers and Deutsche Bank or Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs shouldn't get that. They put a cap on the amount of bonuses because it was felt that bonuses were fueling risk-taking by the investment banks. So how do you stop the risk-taking? You control the bonuses. So there's now a bonus cap in place, and I'll tell you what happened. It's funny. The bonus cap operated as follows. At least I'll tell you the EU version of it. They said, you may not pay a bonus to an investment bank or investment banker more than X times his or her salary. Okay, so if you say somebody was earning $250,000, in the old days you would have been paid a bonus of $5 million or $2 million or $3 million. The new regulation said, no, you can't. You can only pay, I'm just taking an example, okay? You can only pay 1.5 times this person's salary. So 250,000 multiplied by 1.5. So what do the investment banks do? What do the investment bankers do? Well, it's very simple. Exactly, they increase the salaries 5-fold. Result, this regulation is a waste of time. But, you know, politicians and regulators think that they can somehow control the markets. My usual answer is, listen, guys, there's a reason why they're earning 20 million a year. They're cleverer than we are. And if you try to control these guys, they're going to find a way out of it. So here we go. And the other question that we as lawyers, I think probably you too, need to ask is, would these new regulations enacted between 2009 and to date have actually prevented that crash that occurred in 2008? Talk to any practicing global law firm partner and you'll get the answer that I believe. The answer is no, it wouldn't. What was necessary was something completely different, but let's not go into that because that's about how do you prevent a financial collapse. Many of you probably have been reading about fraud in the markets. You've heard about, I'll come to that when I do Finance 3, huge amounts of derivatives trading which has resulted in losses of 2 billion, 3 billion each time. People say that's the kind of thing that has got to be controlled. And the straight answer is each one of those cases, and I'll walk you through them, those of you who are doing Finance 3, were cases of fraud. How do you stop fraud? If somebody is determined to act in the most horrible way and commit fraud, there's not a lot you can do. No regulation can stop fraud. Internal systems can, probably, but not laws. So when a lot of people, politicians and regulators, talk about the markets seeing fraud being done and something needs to be done, the answer isn't more law. Law cannot stop the fraud. After all, we've got laws against burglary, murder, and all sorts of other things. Does it stop it? No, it doesn't. You need something more than that. Anyway, there we are. The only other thing I was going to touch base with you on, which I guess you probably want to be familiar with, is the Eurozone crisis, which is something that happened in Europe. Starting with Greece. Anybody from Greece in the class? Good, you can walk us through this. The Greek crisis. It's over now, or at least we hope it's over. Do you think it's over? The Greek crisis, do you think it's over? No. Good. I think it's not just Greece. I'm just using Greece as the example because that's what triggered it. But it involves Portugal, it involves Ireland, it may now involve even Italy. But let's just understand what it is we're talking about. Greece started with a problem because it joined the euro in 2001, which was fine. And that meant a real advantage for Greece. It could borrow euros by issuing bonds denominated in euros or euro bonds at euro rates. In 2001, nobody distinguished between bonds issued by Greece, Portugal, and Germany, which meant that Greece and Portugal were borrowing at the same rates for euros as Germany was. And a lot of countries borrowed massively because they were getting low interest rates underpinned by the German economy. And then one fine morning, people woke up because many of the countries, Ireland, Portugal, Greece, Italy, were spending this money on public infrastructure projects. Let's not get into an argument about whether that's good or bad, but the result is we're not revenue generating. And that meant there wasn't funding, revenues, to service the debt. What do you mean by servicing debt? Paying interest and principal on the debt that you've taken on, even at these low interest rates. And then came the real bombshell in 2010, where Greece accepted that it had, unfortunately, misstated its financial statistics, that they were inaccurate, that its budget deficit was 400% more than the government statistics showed. Guess what happened next? The global financial markets went into a tailspin. They began selling Greek bonds, not only Greek bonds, Portuguese bonds, Italian bonds, anybody whom they thought was in the same boat. With the result, the investment banks and, far more importantly, investors began distinguishing between Greece on the one side and Germany on the other, meaning in terms of how much interest they would demand from Greece or Portugal as compared with Germany. And guess what happened? Instead of being the same rate, it went up to 300 basis points for Greece above German interest rates. So Greece then found it impossible to borrow in the markets. And they couldn't pay for public sector salaries, for schools, and all the other things that every country needs. And then came another whammy. There are people called rating agencies, the international rating agencies. Standard & Poor's is the leading one. Moody's is the second one. Why are they important? They assign grades to bonds. and loans, bonds in particular. Depending on the ratings given to bonds issued by countries and corporations, investors will say, okay, for a AA rated bond, we will only ask for 3%. For a B rated bond, we want 5%. Now you can see what happens. Greece's ratings crashed. From an A rating in 2009, it went to a CC rating in 2011, issued by Standard & Poor's. With the result, Greece's borrowing costs shot up again, on top of the previous occurrences, with the result that virtually Greece was in a serious financial difficulty. The same thing happened to Portugal, Ireland, and then later to Spain. At that point, something had to be done because otherwise banks are going to go bust, and needless to say, that's when government gets interested, and everybody thinks banks are going to go bust. The first step, the first bandage, was something called the EFSF, the Eurozone Financial Stability Facility, which is essentially a special purpose vehicle company owned by the Eurozone governments into which they put money, and this entity, this special purpose vehicle company, would give money to Greece, to Portugal, and others who needed the money because they couldn't go into the markets to borrow. So they were just borrowing from this new Eurozone facility. That's all they could get money for everything that they needed money for. Essentially, they were bailout funding. That was also backed up by the International Monetary Fund providing more funding to the countries which were in trouble, essentially Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain. The initial setup was not a lot, 445 billion. That sounds like a hell of a lot of money, but it isn't when you look at the liabilities and the needs of Greece and the other Eurozone countries. They received 110 billion, if I remember, in 2011, and later another 155 billion to hold up the finances of the Greek government. On top of that, what was proposed was that since Greece owed money to investors in the markets, to banks and others, it was proposed that they would only pay 50% of what they owed. It's called a haircut, October 2011. But they didn't go ahead with it. Why? Because if the Greek bonds were devalued by 50% and the investors got only 50% of their bonds, guess what happens? The credit derivatives which the bond investors would inevitably have bought would have been triggered, requiring, once again, Lehman Brothers or Deutsche Bank or AIG to take up the losses that the Greek bonds would have caused. So that was not proceeded with. I'll look at all these in some detail later. What we've got now is this thing called the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, set up in 2012 under special treaty and effective from September 2012. That contributed 700 billion euros into this ESM mechanism, which is now the firepower available to the European Commission if any one of the European governments or states gets into serious financial difficulty. It is important, you know why? Because of that. Who's got the debt owed by Greece, Portugal, Spain? Answer, French and German banks. So if Greece and Spain or anyone else gets into difficulty, who's going to be hammered first to do a Lehman Brothers? The German and the French banks. It's Deutsche Bank, it's Banque Paribas, and others. That's not a thought that will enable anyone to sleep well, because banks would start crashing if that happened. If the bonds were to default, the banks would suffer losses. Deutsche Banks, the BNP Paribas would suffer losses. If any one of them goes into default, the results are going to be far worse than 2008. Because not only would they go bust, they will also trigger trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars of credit default swaps, which have been and are being written on French banks, German banks, Greek bonds, Spanish bonds, and the like. So it's a market which is completely interwoven. One link goes, the whole market crushes. And same question. Not all those wonderful regulations that our politicians thought would be effective is going to stop this, if it happens. Okay, that's why I said this is going to be a financial earthquake, which is far greater than the 2007, 2008 investment banking crisis, if it happens. So that sort of kind of brings you up to date. And I mean, I think there's a whole pile of regulations which came up, which I'm going to walk you through at some stage. In the US, they've actually tried to split up investment banking and commercial banking again. If you remember, one of the reasons that resulted in, one of the reasons that spurred investment banks from Japan, sorry, not investment banks, commercial banks from Japan and the US to come to London was that they had something called the Glass-Steagall Act in the US, copied in Japan, which didn't allow commercial banks to do investment banking. So guess what? JP Morgan and Citicorp set up their investment banking operations here because the Glass-Steagall Act didn't apply here. The Japanese commercial banks, the Mizuhos and others, did exactly that. They said, hell with Japan, we'll set up investment banking headquarters right here. Everybody realized their mistake 10 years later. So the US, for example, abolished Glass-Steagall so that investment banks do commercial banking, commercial banks could do investment banking. And guess what? After 2008, back it comes in the form of what is called the Volcker Rule, separating out not completely investment banking, but something called proprietary trading, trading on your own behalf. Separate that from the commercial banking operation of a Citicorp, a JP Morgan, or otherwise. That was a real quick run-through. And lastly, I'm going to mention the unmentionable, the B word. I think the only question that most of us have in the markets is, will Brexit result in the splintering of the global markets, which have currently been pretty cohesive, pretty integrated, and so on? And the thinking is that most of the banks that are operating out of London, for a whole number of reasons, there is one reason which is also of much use to the Nomuras from Japan, the JP Morgans from the US and others, namely that under EU regulations, if you're authorized to carry on that activity in London, you're entitled under EU regulations, under the Investment Services Directive and the Second Banking Directive, to offer those services across Europe with no limitation. And when the B word operates, and the UK maybe walks out in March, those regulations will stop applying, which means that Nomura will not be able to sell bonds or shares or act on behalf of an Italian issuer in Italy, sitting out of London. It's not that the markets have not thought about it, just to bring you up to date. Yes, they have. And what they're doing, instead of moving lock, stock, and barrel Deutsche Bank goes to Milan, what they're doing is setting up sufficient amount of operations in EU member states, be it Germany, be it Italy, be it wherever, which will enable them to get that passport to carry on investment activity, investment business in the European Union, so that they don't really need the old London passport to carry on business, nor do they need to move all their business to Milan or to Frankfurt or to Paris. Mr. Macron is not very happy about that. But still, there we go. So that's the broad run-through. Have you guys finished filling up those forms? You have? Would one of you mind collecting it all the way up? Please, thank you. Any questions before I move on to the legal stuff? Anything, or are you very happy with this?
Just about the...
Please do, anything you like.
I've forgotten about the Volcker Rule in the US.
Yep.
In the UK, they recently did the ring fencing of separation of commercial banks and high funders. So do you think that's going to have a similar effect?
No, I mean, I think what is being done in both the US and here is that certain types of investment banking activity, not all of it, is going to be done from a separately incorporated subsidiary. That's not going to be affected by Brexit. I mean, that's just a separation of certain types of investment banking activities from, oh, thank you very much, from the activities of the group of banks, not group of banks, the banking group. If your question is that going to be effective long term? One answer is that yes, it will stop a collapse of a Lehman-type investment banking operation from spreading into and killing off a commercial bank which is allied to it. The example that everybody has in mind when they did this was Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS. RBS was a Scottish commercial bank which then bought up the investment banking arm of ABN AMRO, the Dutch giant, which included also the UK investment bank Rothschilds. And many people say that the collapse of RBS in 2008 was due to the fact that inside RBS now were two investment banks, the ABN AMRO investment bank and the Rothschild investment bank. So let's separate them out. And if it happens again, well, ABN AMRO and Rothschild investment banks go bust, RBS doesn't. That's the logic behind the separation. Will it work? Who knows? Anything else? Right, now we've got a sort of working Financial Times knowledge of the subject, yeah? I mean, that's all I need. That's all you need. And the reason I say you need it is because otherwise you'll realize it as we go along. I'm saying something and you think, that doesn't make sense. The reason is because you're thinking in the context of a domestic market. That's the major reason for sometimes not understanding. But please remember, if you don't understand, now I'm going to get into the law. If you don't understand, please do not let it go by and think, okay, I'll do lecture capture tonight. And then after you come home, 2 bottles of wine later, and you don't know who's lecturing, never mind what's being lectured. So I suggest, please, if you've got questions, ask. I appreciate that some legal educational cultures will not tolerate questions in class, right? Let me start with France. What do you think? Yes, quite. China? You're not supposed to ask questions and disturb your professor. No, sorry. This is a whole different legal culture, education culture. You are encouraged to ask whatever questions you want. Raise your hand and ask. Okay? Including, sorry, I didn't understand that. I used to do that pretty regularly as a student. My professor used to go bananas when I asked him for the 3rd time, but it's a good thing to do. Okay, so that's where we are. I'm going to now get on to the first major topic, which again is actually foundational. It's to do with the conflict of laws rules. No, I can't even find it anymore. Conflict of laws rules applicable in relation to financial market transactions. Where is it? Oh, God. By the way, have you guys seen the reading lists that are on Keats? Yeah? Okay. And secondly, have you had a look at the exam paper which is on Keats? You should, because it'll give you a feel for what you're trying to achieve. Okay? They're all fact pattern based exams. But I think it's useful for you to just have a look at it so you know that this is what you're looking at. Where the hell is this thing I'm going to talk about? Excuse me, I'm very slow at getting this. Induction, brochures, 1 and 2. God's sake. Oh, thank you. This is when I realized that the one topic I need is not on my set of slides. Where is it? Got it. Okay, that's just a summary of what I'm going to cover in LOIF 1. Okay, and what I've just run through this introduction to international financial markets. I'm now going to look at this one. Conflict laws in international financial market transactions, okay? Which is what I'm going to get onto next. Any questions? Your neighbor is unlikely to know the answer. Do ask.
You could take a 5-minute break, 10-minute break.
You want a break?
I'm always up for a break. Refocus.
I mean, you're entitled to have a break. Of course you are. But here's a thing. I thought you guys had a break writing your names down. But here's the thing. When you step out there in about 10 months' time, not only will you have no break, you will not have dinner, and you will not sleep, because sometimes they're called all-nighters, all-night transactions. So learning to concentrate was part of the training I went through. You go in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you are still there at 3 in the morning, and you're still having to concentrate because that guy from Linklaters is coming up with more and more brilliant points. Anyway, sorry, you want a 5-minute break now? You do or not? Okay. Anybody wants a break, just raise your hand, okay? Can you concentrate? You can. See, you got to. These are the guys who are going to be on the other side of the table one day, 10 months time. Okay. This subject of conflict of laws in financial transactions. And I actually entitled this thing Governing Law and Transaction Insulation. And I'm going to walk you through this concept of transaction insulation, because that's what we do as lawyers in global market transactions. And the reason for this concept of transaction insulation being used is that most of our transactions, not most, all of our transactions, involve a number of jurisdictions, which means a whole number of different law systems affecting a transaction. A simple example, an international bond issue denominated in euros or dollars or yen being handled by US, Japanese, French investment banks for a Russian corporation. The bonds are sold out of London into the hands of pension funds, hedge funds, government funds, insurance companies located in Mexico, Brazil, China, India, and Japan. Just a very simple example. That means you're talking a whole number of law systems. Many law systems, many laws are potentially applicable. Why is that undesirable? And it is. Because the more law systems which apply, the more uncertainty there is in the legal framework, the legal structure. Uncertainty is something that investment banks and global corporations and investors do not like. So our job as lawyers is to try and remove the uncertainty due to the potential applicability of a whole number of law systems in a global market transactions. And worst of all, needless to say, these laws that are potentially applicable are also potentially in conflict. And that's not something the global markets want, investment banks, hedge funds, investors, and others. Certainty is at the heart of raising finance and making money. So question, how do we do it? That's an example of a syndicated loan, and you can see how many countries are involved. The same goes for an international bond. So many countries, so many law systems. So, what is it we do? Because there's no convention, no treaty governing all of this stuff, the technology that's used by the global law firms, and it is standard technology, is that every major global financial market transaction is subject to a single law system through an express choice of law clause called the governing law clause. The objective is to try and subject as many legal aspects of that transaction to one system of law. And secondly, to try and exclude the applicability of other law systems. That's what we mean by this concept of transaction insulation. You apply a chosen law system to a global market transaction by an express clause called a governing law clause, with the objective, with the clear legal objective of controlling as much and as many aspects of that global market transaction by reference to that chosen system of law. And secondly, to eliminate the applicability of other law systems. That's called transaction insulation. Question is, well, how do we do this? How does it work? Well, the effectiveness of insulation of the type that we are now talking about depends on three things. First of all, it depends on the law system you choose to apply and control the legal aspects of a global transaction. How does it work? What are the rules in place? But extremely importantly, it's not what is the rule, it's how does it work in practice. You can take a rule under German law, Japanese law, English law, New York law, and it all looks very similar. Not much of a difference. That's the written rule. What we as lawyers are interested in is how does that rule work in practice? Why? Because the same rules in different law systems actually work differently in practice because of the nature of the different law systems. And I think it's one of the first concepts to understand. The similar rules in different law systems work differently. And for that you need to know that there are different groups of law systems. I'll very quickly walk you through it. Different groups of law systems. We call them legal clans. And the rules that are common to different clans, however, work differently in each clan. The second objective, the second basis, the second effectiveness, the second factor which affects the effectiveness of insulation is the extent of control. You remember we said we're trying to control as many aspects of the transaction as possible by this governing law expressly chosen? Well, question, what aspects of a transaction does the governing law control? That's a question for the chosen law itself. If you choose New York law, you've got to ask the question under New York law, what aspects of a transaction does New York law control if New York law is the governing law? Then you'll know how far it goes in terms of control. For example, something that always goes outside the chosen law's control, whether or not a corporate entity, Gazprom of Russia, has got the capacity, corporate legal capacity to engage in this transaction. That usually falls outside the control of the governing law. That's just an example. We have a whole pile of things we'll look at in detail shortly. The third one, and extremely importantly, is there's no point in having a chosen governing law and saying, yeah, it controls everything, if the moment you step outside the courts of that country, everybody else refuses to recognize it. So you need a law system, if chosen as a governing law, is recognized outside that country, be it in Japan, be it in Brazil, be it in the US, be it in Germany. Recognition of the chosen law to control the aspects of the transaction that we as lawyers wanted to control. So those three are fundamental to how we approach insulation. Now I'm going to, instead of going through a long PhD thesis on how this happens, I'm going to tell you the bottom line on how it has happened, what we're doing in the markets, and then work backwards from there, okay? The governing law that we now use in practice, in real life, in the global financial markets is either New York law and English law. You'll find that if you read about the newspapers about Argentina, the collapse of Argentina, it's defaulting of bonds, defaulting on loans, have a look at what law controls those bonds, what law controls those loans. Answer, New York law. If you look at Greek bonds, for example, on this side of the Atlantic, or Russian dollar bonds, governed by English law. It's just the way it's worked. And what I'm going to do is to walk you through how did we end up here. Why not Japanese law? Why not German law? Why not Brazilian law? Why not any other system of law? Let's try and understand the legal factors which contribute to this, because these are operational right now and have been operational for the last 25 years or so of the markets. This choice of the markets has got another impact in the context of the law of international finance. Namely, the legal documentation, and I mean the standard legal documentation, developed by the global law firms and others, and including trade associations, have been developed under New York and English law. For example, even standard documentation like those applied in bonds, which are promulgated by the International Capital Markets Association, or ICMA, is under English law. Similarly, with regard to derivatives, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association has got its documentation under English and New York law, but it does have, to be straightforward on this, direct on this, yes, it does have variations under Japanese law. It has a variation under Russian law and so on. But the basic documentation is under English and or New York law. So that's the bottom line, and what I want to do next is why? Why are we here? Why did we end up like that? To understand that, let's go back to that first question. Effectiveness of insulation. How effective is a choice of governing law clause? And that, I said, depends, A, on the type of law system that you've chosen and how it works in practice. That second bit is far more important than the first. How does a rule operate in practice under different law systems? Now, there are, in fact, to understand this, just some basics. There are a number of legal clans where the same rule operates differently. This category, we call it the common law clan. In it is obviously England, states of the United States of America, Australia, Canada, India, Singapore, Malawi, New Zealand, Cyprus, Myanmar, Malaysia, and many others. Second group, the Napoleonic clan, where the same rules operate differently in practice. And that is we found in France because it is the Napoleonic Code, absorbed into Italy, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and Greece in Europe, and across South America, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Paraguay, Bolivia, and so on, and in North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, and others. So that's the second major grouping of law systems. The third, the Romano-Germanic clan, which includes Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Netherlands. And then there's a fourth category of what we call the sui generis, meaning can't be fitted into any one particular grouping. You have their own grouping. Japan, which is broadly Germanic-based. Russia, China, which is obviously not based on anything that is which is of French or Germanic origin. It's its own master. There's Turkey. There's South Africa, which is a mix of English law and Dutch law. And then there are law systems like Thailand, which are not based entirely on any one European law system. And then, of course, there are the Islamic law systems such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, the important point about putting these into little boxes is to pinpoint that the same rule that we will look at will operate differently depending on which legal clan you're looking at. And that affects which law system we use to apply to a global market transaction. So let's look at what we call the strength of insulation. How far, how effective, what does it control? Question. What does the law system control if you choose that law system to apply, for example, in a normal, straightforward, basic syndicated loan? This is a question for the conflict of laws rules of the chosen governing law. Secondly, how far it's effective also depends, as I said earlier, recognition by other law systems of the chosen law as being able to control, for example, contractual validity. For instance, whether a contract has been properly performed. Okay? Now, as a model of this, and I would say probably the best model anywhere on the globe, is the Rome Regulation of the EU. It sets out in absolute clarity what a law system will control if the chosen law system falls within the parameters of the Rome rules. And it's very useful to look at. It's one of the best, is probably the best model that there is. First of all, the Rome Regulation of the EU provides that if you choose a law system, that law system will control validity of the contractual obligations in that transaction. So what is called substantial and essential validity of contractual obligations. It will control all formal validity, i.e. what kind of formalities are required in relation to a particular transaction. Whether a transaction contract is being discharged, has been terminated lawfully or no. How do we interpret the clauses of a transaction document? Article 12 says governing law again. So it is very important structure that is found in that regulation of the EU. Consequences of breach, including assessment of damages for breach, governed by the governing law. Whether transaction is completely null and void, controlled by the governing law. This is a complete regime model. And on top of that is the recognition rule in the Rome Regulation. We call it Rome 1, because there's a Rome 2 later, which I'll come to. The rules of recognition. Rome 1 requires that under the Rome rules, any court in the EU must recognize the validity of the chosen governing law in relation to a transaction, in relation to all these things that I've just mentioned. Must recognize it wherever the court is within the EU, and very importantly, this little bit, even if the governing law chosen is not the law of a member state in the EU. Best example, New York law controlled bond issue. Every EU court must, under Rome rules, recognize New York governing law in relation to the control of all these matters that are mentioned in the Rome Regulation. It's a huge advance in global law, this regulation. People always say, whoa, what happens after Brexit? Doesn't matter. Because even if English law is not a law system of the EU, i.e. not a member state, that rule still applies. Doesn't matter where the country is from, if you've chosen that law system, the EU rules require recognition in all of the 27 member states. So that's an example of how a chosen law can control all these things. In the case of the EU rules, consolidated in the Rome Regulation. Now, Rome-type rules are to be found in a number of other jurisdictions, but nothing as clear as the EU rules. For example, the US rule in the restatement of the conflict of laws of the United States, the second restatement, requires recognition of the conflict of laws rules, under conflict of laws rules, of any law system chosen as a governing law. There was an exception to that, which said that there had to be, where is that? Hang on. I'll tell you, it's not on this slide. There was a provision which said that the recognition of the chosen governing law under the US restatement of the conflict of laws rules would only be given if there is a close connection of the transaction with that law system. So if you chose New York law, for example, to govern a transaction which had no connection with New York, all its connections with Japan, the old law would say, no, sorry, US law would not recognize that choice. Now you can imagine that was a bit of a disaster for New York practitioners, because it meant that they couldn't give an opinion saying, yeah, absolutely, New York law will control all aspects because of that rule. Therefore, obviously, for obvious reasons, that rule is amended by the General Obligations Law 5-1401, which requires recognition not only of New York governing law, but any other governing law clause, regardless of any connection with the law system and the transaction which has this governing law clause. And if those are your interesting cases, don't read it, but there is a case in point. So the law in the US is pretty much in line with what we have in the EU, but as I said, the codification in the EU Rome regulation is a lot clearer. Now, there are limitations, of course, to the ability of a governing law to control aspects of a transaction. I'm going to deal, first of all, with the Rome regulation again. Under the Rome regulation, there is an exception to the control of the governing law. First of all, the Rome regulation says that if all of the elements of a transaction are connected with another law system other than the chosen governing law. So, supposing you choose New York law, and the transaction is entirely connected with Japan, then Rome 1 says, Article 3.3, no, that can't happen, because all the elements of the transaction are connected with another law system. Just to check whether you're awake, is this rule of any importance to you? Is it of any applicability to you, who we're looking at? That means you are asleep, or were asleep. Clearly no, isn't it? You're right. Because, by definition, we are in the global international markets. We started this discussion with raising an issue, a problem, that each transaction is multi-jurisdictional, connected with a whole number of countries. So Article 3.3, which refers to transactions which are where the elements are all connected with one jurisdiction, is of no use, of no value, of no applicability to what we are looking at. Are you clear on that? Because I hear this, oh, what about Article 3? No, it's nothing to do with what we are talking about. Are you clear about why? If not, raise your hand and say, I didn't understand a darn thing you were saying. Explain it again, please. Yeah.
But can there be a transaction that is global without passing through the EU?
Of course.
So it affects us. I mean, we're talking about global transactions.
Yeah. Let's talk about multi-jurisdiction. Now we are lawyers. Multi-jurisdiction. Legally, they are multi-jurisdictional. They're global transactions which have the effect of being touched by so many law systems. Okay, your question.
Yeah, so if there can be multi-jurisdictional that does not go to the EU, so this does not apply anymore.
No, I think okay. Let's take a Japanese bond issue. Sorry, not a Japanese bond issue. A bond issue by a Japanese issuer, sold to Brazilian investors, insurance companies in Mexico, governments in Kazakhstan, and so on. Okay. What connection does it have with the EU? Not a lot. Okay? What Rome 1 says is that if we've chosen a governing law for that transaction, let's say we've chosen New York law for it, every court in the EU must recognize the New York governing law and the control of New York law in relation to all of these things. Yeah? We clear on that? Then there is this exception in Article 3.3. Does it have any application to the transaction we are just talking about? None. Because by definition, the transactions which we are concerned with in this class, and when you practice out there in practice, are global transactions with multi-jurisdictional impacts. There is no transaction which comes within Article 3.3. Okay? Sorry, hang on. I'm looking at the wrong one. Article 3.3. So, the only exception that you have in Rome 1 is an override. Okay, guys, questions? Facebook? Facebook or question? Do ask. I mean, seriously. I mean, I just really need to get you away from this. Don't want to ask questions. I'm going to be shouted at. No, you're not. You're going to be welcome for questions. So do ask, okay? One override which you have in the Rome 1 regulation. Supposing you've chosen a law system to control a transaction, all aspects of the transaction, as set out in the Rome regulation. But the performance of the transaction, let's take a syndicated loan. Place of performance, repayment of the dollars to be in New York, repayment of euros to be in Milan, repayment of yen to be in Tokyo, repayment of South African currency in Cape Town. Okay? That's the place of performance. Let's suppose that in South Africa, there is a government prohibition saying no payment shall be made to a foreign bank in South Africa for the next 2 years. Rome 1 rules say, well, if New York law has been chosen, New York law must determine everything. Forget South African law. But then there is this exception. It's called the Article 9.3 exception for the law of the place of performance. If South Africa is the place of performance for repayment, and South African law says, no, you will not pay. Article 9.3 of Rome now requires recognition of the law of the place of performance, overriding, over and above and overriding the control of New York law in respect of all aspects of the transaction. This is a very important rule, and the reason is very simple. I gave you South Africa, but this is something that happens every other year in relation to what is called government-imposed moratoria. Moratorium means a government saying, no, corporations from this country are not going to repay international loans for the time being. It's happened in Argentina. It's happened in Greece, just to talk about recent times. Happened in Russia, happened in Malaysia, you can keep going. With the result that although you've got a governing law saying New York law controls or English law controls or whatever law controls, nevertheless, if the regulations in the place of performance says you corporation, you borrower will not pay dollars from here, from Cape Town, or from Argentina, or from Greece. The EU regulation says the governing law is overridden in favor of the law of the place of performance. Want to think that one through?
But is it possible to have more than one place of performance?
Indeed you have. In generally the answer is yes, but when I talk about syndicated loans, I'll tell you how we as lawyers have virtually written this rule out of existence. But this is the technical law. Let's understand it first. Then we can talk about how we've just completely got rid of it in practice. But anyway, just first the rules, okay? And then we can talk through what we've done. Now, just to go back to Greece. It's a classic example of the operation of the rule. The Greek government had issued bonds denominated, first of all, under Greek law and bonds denominated under English law. When Greece wanted to impose a moratorium, i.e., no Greek corporation is going to pay dollars or euros or anything else to foreign lenders, the first question that someone had to think about is, well, what is the effectiveness of that Greek regulation? You go back into Rome 1, it says only the governing law matters, nothing else. So if you've got an English law governed Greek bond, the Greek regulation is irrelevant. If you look at a Greek law governed bond, the Greek regulation is effective because it's part of the governing law. Now, Let's look at this one, the law of the place of performance rules. Supposing that a bond governed by English law issued by a Greek corporation or the Greek government required repayment of euros, not in London, but in Athens. Now what happens? The place of performance is Athens. The law of the place of performance is Greek law. Therefore, under the Rome regulations, the control of English governing law is overridden by Greek law as the law of the place of performance. Therefore, the Greek regulation saying no Greek borrower will repay euros to a foreign lender is effective under Rome rules. Now you can guess that in practice we didn't do that for that very reason. But in practice, the place of performance is always away from the control of countries which are likely to cause a problem. But Greece is a good example. Argentina is exactly the same. All Argentine bonds, all Argentine loans denominated in dollars were payable not in Argentina, not in Buenos Aires, but in New York. Therefore, governing New York law controlled the transaction to the exclusion of Argentine law. Place of performance, New York, for the repayment of loans or bonds. Therefore, if you applied the EU rules, the answer was sorry. Argentine regulations saying you will not pay your foreign lenders is irrelevant. I'll stop at this point and let you mull this over because I can see a pile of faces going, ooh, what is he talking about? Yeah, it is complex, and I thought we'd deal with this right away because you know why? This is the most enthusiastic period of your time doing a module like this. So I thought I'd throw the difficult technical stuff at this point, so you still got the enthusiasm to try and understand it and plow through it. Okay, now, the best way of understanding it is through questions. So let's take it through. Yeah?
Please, can you give us examples, but easier examples of such transactions? Now this one I understood, but I was already...
Okay, what is it that you want me to explain?
About rule.
Which one? Which rule?
Rome.
Rome 1 rule, all of them. Okay, okay. I'm not going to go through the lecture again, but I'm just going to summarize it for you, okay? We were trying to talk about transaction insulation. How do we control the legal aspects and legal obligations inside a transaction from being affected by a whole number of law systems? Prevent it from being robbed of certainty. How do we do that? Answer by an express governing law clause. Rome 1 rules actually give effect to that concept by saying that if you choose an express governing law by an express clause in your transaction documentation, all courts in the EU would recognize it without question. In the EU, subject to this exception. Even though you've got a governing law, if the place of performance, and in practice that means the place of payment of a loan or a bond, happens to be in the country enacting legislation, the EU rules would require the governing law to give effect to the rules at the place of performance. And that's why I took Greece and Argentina. In the Greek example, the bonds were governed either by English law or New York law, English law or Greek law, depending on what bonds they were. But all the euro-denominated bonds were under English law. So the question arose when Greece, the government of Greece, imposed a moratorium and said, right, that's it. We're only going to pay 50% of the value of these bonds. Was that effective or not? No. Answer, no, because of Rome 1. English law controls. Greek law saying only 50% will be paid was not part of English governing law. Next question, did it fall within Article 9.3? i.e., was the place of performance within Greece? Because if so, the Greek legislation had effect. When you look at the documentation, you'll have seen that the place of performance was not Greece for euros. It was London or Frankfurt. Okay? Okay, any other questions? Please talk through. Yeah, go ahead, please. Whichever.
How do you determine the place of performance?
Thank you. Good question. How do you say what is the place of performance? Just like the governing law, the place of performance is designated in all contractual documentation. So in a syndicated loan, it will say, which is usually involves, say, 4 currencies, say dollars, euros, yen, and take your pick, New Zealand dollars. Okay? There will be a place of performance designated for each currency. So dollars, for example, could be New York, it could be London. Yen could be Tokyo, it could be Frankfurt. Euros, it could be Paris, or it could be London. There is a designation of where should you pay. And I think the important point I made earlier was that in order to make sure that this rule doesn't apply and mess up your transaction, you put the place of performance outside a location where you're likely to get Athens-type, Argentina-type legislation. Yeah.
Just on that point, say your place of performance wasn't something today at risk. Tomorrow it becomes a risk country, and therefore there is a chance that there will be more return. Would you then build in clauses where you provide alternatives?
Absolutely. When we do syndicated loans, place of performance, place of payment, you'll see that, first of all, you pick a location which is most unlikely to have regulations. Usually London, New York, Frankfurt, Tokyo, least likely. And then you have a backup provision. You're absolutely right in what you said. Say, alternatively, performance could be given in blah, so that if in the very unlikely event that there is a moratorium applicable in New York, I shouldn't say unlikely because it has happened. In New York, then alternative place of performance, London. Alternative place of performance, Frankfurt. I mean, I'm glad you raised this because although you can't imagine a moratorium being imposed by the US government, because that's a country which cannot go bankrupt, everybody will be bankrupt. And therefore you don't expect moratoria to be imposed in the same way that you had an Argentine moratorium or a Greek moratorium or a Russian moratorium. Nevertheless, the US is in the habit of not imposing moratoria, but imposing regulations which are essentially penal. Like you may not repay loans to a Russian bank, for example, or an Iranian bank.
And also there are certain countries where you have foreign exchange. And those countries say we have to have a location there as a mandate. Say infrastructure in a third world country like Bangladesh. And you have to have as one of the places location.
There's absolutely no problem with that. I mean, not in normal syndicated loans, but in project finance, you're right. In project finance, a host government, which is the host state for an oil pipeline or a gas installation, will say payments must go through our country, at least as one alternative. But of course you say, yes, of course we'll put a clause in saying payable in Kazakhstan. And then you say, alternatively, payable in London. The rule goes again out of the window. So there are, I mean, what we are going to look at, and that's why I said we are going to look at the practical lawyering, is how do we use these rules? When do we have to develop clauses which actually gets around the problems which are being created by some of these rules? I mean, at the moment, all I'm doing is giving you the rules, basic stuff. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, please do. Here comes the point at which you've got to say, remember that slide I had, who's in the global markets? You're no longer looking at domestic corporations. You're no longer looking at banks which have got one office in Athens or one office in Buenos Aires. These are global corporations and global banks. Why is that relevant? Because, your question, how are you going to get money out of Athens to pay under a syndicated loan under New York law or English law? Answer is very straightforward. A bank, in a Greek bank or an Argentine bank, will have funds outside its home state in real life. And that's the reason why we are structured in this way. Now, yes, your next question is going to be, so what's going to happen to the Greek bank which breaks Greek rules? Bad luck. You're caught between Scylla and Charybdis. Namely, you comply, you're in breach of English or New York law, contempt of court. If you don't comply, you're in breach of Greek regulations. Go to jail in either case. Yeah, it is a problem. And it's a problem for people who are operating in international finance. And it's something we'll talk about as we go along. It's a problem that arises quite regularly. You're caught by two sets of conflicting regulations. And inevitably, what happens, you want to know the practical end of it. In Argentina, for example, they would go to the government and say, if you do this, if you prevent me from paying, I'm going to be held in contempt of court in New York. What's worse, all our assets across the globe will be frozen by a New York court, crippling our ability to operate. We'll talk about this as we go along, because it is a fundamental of global markets that whatever law that applies is to be enforced by a court. And we'll come to that in a few minutes. The choice of court usually follows choice of law. And the choice of court is important because you need a court which can deliver a judgment within 24 hours or less, and it's then recognized and enforced as widely as possible. In particular, in the global financial centers where most countries, most corporations, and most banks have their liquid assets. If you're trying to follow Argentina, you're not going to chase all their wonderful sheep farms or cattle farms. You're after their liquid assets. Where are they? New York, London, Frankfurt, Switzerland, wherever. That's where you go. So I keep remembering this. These are transactions in the global market concept, because that will help you understand how does this work. Because you're absolutely right in the question you raised. Okay, let's move on. The actual terminology of Article 9.3 is that the governing law is required to step aside in relation to the law of the place of performance, if performance has got to be effected in a country which then passes laws. But it's only mandatory provisions of the law of the place of performance which apply. Now, I don't want to walk you through this definition because, frankly, we're not going into litigation to work out what is the meaning of it. I just put it up there so you know there is this concept of not every law in the law of in the place of performance is relevant, but only mandatory laws, whatever they are. Okay? I don't think you need to worry about it for the moment. But just so you know that there is a definition in Article 9.1 of Rome. Okay. Now, next thing I want to do, oops, wait a minute. Oh, yes. To walk you through the common law systems in relation to these same rules. Not the EU rules, common law rules. That is to say, law systems which followed English law before English law got sucked into and became part of European law. So you're talking common law systems everywhere across the globe, from New Zealand to Singapore to Australia to Nigeria to wherever. The rule is, once again, yes, you may choose that law system as the chosen governing law if you so wish for a global transaction, even if there is no connection with that country. Remember, New York law has the same rule. Even without any connection with New York, you can choose New York law for a global transaction. But in other common law countries, that same rule applies, with one exception: illegality by the law of the place of performance. I.e., the place of performance is located in a place where the law says, no, you can't make this payment, then the governing law will recognize it. Have you heard that one before? Have you heard that rule before? Yeah, about 5 minutes ago, from me. In relation to what? The Rome regulation. I think you guys have had it. That first line is Article 3 of Rome. If you use a governing law, it controls all these things that I mentioned. Subject to one exception, law of the place of performance. Illegality by the law of the place of performance. That's the old common law, which is now the law right across the Union. And it also means one other thing from our perspective as lawyers in the markets. The law now is true in the US, in Canada, which is a common law system, US, Canada, right across the common law world and right across the EU, which gives a certain uniformity in the rules that are being applied. It's very, from a practical perspective, a really important result of the way the law is developed. The old common law still is there in Canada, is there in Australia, in India, in Singapore, in Hong Kong. In the UK, we have got the Rome rules. Fortunately, the new Rome rules, the Rome I rules, and the old common law are exactly the same. So we're applying the same rules literally across the globe until you reach Japan or China or those countries outside this set of rules. Those of you who are interested in case law, it's not necessary. The common law rule saying if you choose a governing law, regardless of whether it has a connection with the transaction, you can use it, is Vita Food Products decided in 1939, and the case which says there's illegality by the law of the place of performance, that will need to be recognized by governing law, is Kleinwort, and who's German here? Anybody from Germany? Only one. Come on, guys. Give me a break. I know Brexit is in March, and nobody knows whether we are going or not, but must be more German lawyers than that. I just want you to pronounce it, because I can't. I think it's Ungarische Baumwolle, right? Something? Go ahead, please. Sorry? Thank you. Perfect pronunciation, exactly. So, those are the two cases. If you want a case, by the way, they're summarized in my book if you just want to look it up. But it's not necessary. It's just the background knowledge that this is the basis of the common law in so many different jurisdictions. Yeah, I've dealt with this. New York law, there used to be a rule requiring reasonable or substantive connection with the law system before a chosen governing law was recognized, which is in section 1105 of the Uniform Commercial Code, but that has been abolished under the New York law of 1984, 5-1401, which says you can choose New York law even without any connection with New York, provided that the transaction is worth more than $250,000, which is a bit of a joke, isn't it? Even the lawyers are paid 10 times that. Never mind the value of the transaction. Right. How are we faring? So that's the first step in this process, which has led the markets to reach out for English and New York law. The need for transaction insulation and the insulation, the cocoon, the protective cocoon provided to a transaction by the governing law, both under the Rome rules, under common law rules, and under the New York rules. So that's the first leg of our discussion. What other factors come into play here? Okay, I'll stop with the next one, okay? From the point of view of the markets, who are the markets? The investors, the participants who are pension funds, insurance companies, hedge funds, governments, central banks and others. Secondly, the investment banks. Thirdly, the global corporations. From their perspective, in relation to these transactions, what is the most important legal aspect that they're looking for? It's that. Complete certainty and complete result predictability. What they're not interested, absolutely not interested, is what lawyers generally will say. A court can determine that. And a banker from Morgan Stanley will say, I'm here to make money. I'm not interested in what bloody judges have to say. So you make sure that what you have put together, structured, works with absolute certainty and with absolute result predictability. I'm not interested in going to court. We don't want to go to court. In 30 years, there's hardly been a case which has landed in front of the New York courts or the English courts, just to be precise about the level of certainty and result predictability achieved by the lawyering in the markets. But what are we trying to do when we say, what law system gives us result predictability and certainty as high above 90%? Well, the most important aspect is that it eliminates the potential for disputes and litigation. From the point of view of the market participants, the investors, the investment banks, litigation is an utter, unmitigated waste of time. And they want to rule it out. Your job, my job, everybody's job as lawyers is to make sure it doesn't happen. So this is about what law systems produce this level of certainty and result predictability. And key to that is the ability of that law system to enable documentation to be drafted, however long it is, precisely with express clauses on how this transaction is going to work in practice, what are the rights and obligations of the parties, absolutely clearly, and what are the things that would happen in different eventualities as the transaction continues. Don't forget, these are transactions which will continue for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, syndicated loan, bond, whatever. And during that entire period, the transaction documentation must work with such precision that every possible eventuality has been covered by the Clifford Chances, the Linklaters, and Sullivan and Cromwells. Otherwise, Morgan Stanley does not want to know. ExxonMobil doesn't want to know. So that's the objective: clarity, result predictability. So what they want, therefore, is a law system where the courts will enforce precisely to the letter what has been drafted and agreed between all parties. Now you might think, hey, doesn't that happen in all law systems? Well, actually, no. And here are the questions you've got to ask yourself. When you got a transaction document drafted very clearly, very precisely, running to hundreds of pages, do the judges of the courts of the chosen law system have the power to interfere with those carefully drafted clauses? In particular, the default clauses in syndicated loan agreements, i.e., when can you terminate and ask for your money? Default clauses in bond issues. When can a bond issue be terminated and the bond investor saying, I want my money back, please? Or in derivatives transactions. What constitutes a default? What rights do you have when a default occurs? And from the perspective of the markets, the banks, and the investors, the one thing they need is absolute certainty about their rights on the occurrence of a default. Now, they are not interested in justice. Nobody cares about justice. This is money-making law, not justice. So what we're looking for is enforceability of a transaction, regardless of whether or not the breach was minor, non-material, who cares? Or that no substantial damage has been suffered by the banks or the investors, who cares? That the consequences of the breach of the transactional document and the obligations are not serious, nobody cares. And even more importantly, if the breach occurred due to no fault of the borrower or one of the parties, irrelevant. You're in breach, you're in breach, you're in breach. No question of unfairness to the borrower or the issuer can be given effective. Why do I raise these 6 points? Because under English and New York law, each of these is irrelevant. Completely and totally irrelevant. You can't say, hey, not my fault. Some guy that I asked the funds to be transferred went to sleep. Took a holiday in Rio. Bad luck. It's your job. You're in default. Not my fault. Doesn't work. Oh gosh, the resulting loss is non-existent. Let's take a simple example. Thou shalt pay interest at 2 p.m. New York time every 3 months. Tuesday. You don't pay. You pay at 2:30. Has anybody suffered any damage? No. Is that a default under English or New York law? Absolutely yes. Doesn't matter that the breach hasn't resulted in loss, that the breach is minor, it doesn't matter. Default is a default is a default. Ask Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, ExxonMobil, or somebody like that. The answer is not interested. This is what the document says. That's what we want the law to say. We don't want judges or courts saying, well, come on. This is not nice. This is not really relevant. This is not, in Superman's words, truth, justice, and the American way. Irrelevant. You heard that phrase, haven't you? Truth, justice, and the American way. Exactly. You watched that latest Superman movie. It's really good. Anyway, sorry. Now, there's the common law on this subject, which is quite clear. There is strict liability for any breach of contract, regardless of those things that I've just itemized up there. And if you want a case, those who want to go read cases, there it is. You'll find that here comes the difference in the way rules operate. That in many other law systems, and this might explain or give maybe one of the reasons why markets don't use these law systems too regularly. Interference by judges on the grounds of reasonableness, fairness, absence of loss, it's a minor breach. You'll find operational in many a law system in the Napoleonic class. There's a few examples of it. Article 1184 and 1184.3 of the French Civil Code, judges' rights in the event of a breach to interfere in the default rights of the innocent party. Similarly, Article 1455 of the Italian Civil Code. Now, these are all good provisions, and by no means saying these are not good. They're excellent provisions in order to produce justice. Like I said, ExxonMobil, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Nomura are not interested in justice. It's about the money. So, truth, justice, and the American way is irrelevant. Any law system which thinks about truth, justice, and the American way is not one which is favored. Next, force majeure. Now, every law system outside the common law world has got force majeure. I.e., if something happens which interferes with the performance of an obligation caused by what they call act of God or tsunamis or whatever, it can interfere with the obligation to perform. Under English and New York law, there is no doctrine of force majeure. If you want force majeure in your documentation, you would include it as a specific clause. You don't. In syndicated loans, in bonds, there is no force majeure clause. And therefore, anything that happens which constitutes force majeure under Italian law or French law or Spanish law or Brazilian law has no application under English or New York law. The next one, no doctrine of onerous performance in English or New York law. One of the best examples of this, the German judgments which were given way back in 1922, when transaction documentation obligations were undertaken, when the Reichsmark for the US dollar was 192 Reichsmarks for the US dollar. Reichsmark collapsed, and in December 1923, there were 4,200,000 Reichsmarks to the dollar. That was the kind of currency crash that occurred. German court said, well, if you've undertaken obligations to pay in dollars, you're exempt, because this is absurd. One day it was 192, and now it's 4.2 million. Now, the onerous performance exception is also found in, you look at 1467 of the Italian Civil Code, and you'll see it. Common law, English law, there it is. Onerous performance, irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether there is a wholly abnormal rise or fall in prices or a sudden depreciation of the currency, it does not matter, thou shalt pay. This is where you say, well, what about justice and fairness? Well, there ain't any. If I don't get thrown out in the next 3 minutes, I want to deal with one clause, which raises this problem very clearly. The cross-default clause. In every syndicated loan, in every bond issue, in every global market transaction, there is a cross-default clause, which goes as follows. Even if you don't breach this provision, your obligations, if your associate company in Japan or your subsidiary in New Zealand breaches any contract of a financial nature, you are declared in default. to me. Now, go away and think what happens under German law or French law to a clause like that one. I will talk through next week because I think we're running out of time. But that cross-default clause is fundamental, absolutely fundamental to the markets. And unless a cross-default clause cannot be interfered with by judges, is recognized as written, markets don't want to know. And you'll find, if you want to just do some research on it, that cross-default clauses are either non-operational or can be interfered with under many other law systems. One of the major reasons why English and New York law are chosen by the markets. Okay, let's leave it at that, and I will pick up next week. In the meantime, I'll try and have a go at these seminar groups. I forgot to say, any questions? Okay, thanks.
Good.